Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I finished up The Amazing Digital Circus, which ran from 2023 to 2026. I don't know how to date this, it's an online series. If you are not particularly on YouTube or in animation spaces or those sorts of things, I don't even really know. You may not be familiar with The Amazing Digital Circus, but it is a web series that was created initially on YouTube and then eventually licensed out, starting in 2023. Back, I want to say pretty close to when it released, I watched the pilot episode, which came out in October of 2023, I believe. And I think at the time it had, I want to say like 20-ish million views, which by the metrics of an indie animation is pretty good numbers for YouTube at this time. That said, as of recording, it has over almost 450 million, which is substantially more. It became a viral sensation by all accounts, and we'll get into that in a minute. But that was in October 2023. I watched the original episode probably around that time, since the numbers were pretty low at that point, and then promptly forgot about it. Because I think I was watching an episode of Hell of a Boss or something like that. And it just came up in the suggested on the side at the time. And I went and watched it because it was like 20 some odd minutes for the first episode for the pilot. And because there weren't any additional episodes, and because my reaction to the initial episode was, that was pretty good. Not really extraordinary, but pretty good. I just sort of forgot about it until maybe a year ago, when the cultural touchstone that it was, the level of virality and fandom around it, became so enormous that I became sort of aware of it again. And the 9th and final episode released today. It also released a couple of weeks ago, I believe, in theaters in a limited theatrical release. The final episode's only like 58 minutes, I believe. And I believe in the theatrical releases, they paired it with the 8th episode so you could watch them together and sort of see the continuity together. But I didn't do that, and actually I didn't watch even after, like a year ago when I found out that this had become such a big thing. I didn't go and watch it for a couple of reasons. One, again, I wasn't that enthused about it. I was like, it's fine. I'll go watch it when it's done. And also the how do I say this politely? I can't say it politely. The fandom is insufferable. They are the Amazing Digital Circus fandom is one of the worst that I have seen in a long time. It's not the worst I've ever seen, but it is up there. We're approaching like we're approaching, Tumblr focus of the year levels of stuff. We're approaching things like Homestuck and Ruby and even Hell of a Boss and what's the Has Been Hotel levels of bad. Although I would say Has Been's less bad than The Amazing Digital Circus. So I really kept away from this because I was hit over the head with it pretty aggressively and did not like what I saw. Because, okay, we don't need to unpack the fandom, but it's basically full of a lot of teenagers and immature people, which is weird because that really doesn't seem to be the target audience, or not an audience that actually understands what's going on in the series. So all this back around to about 2 months ago or so, maybe, a friend organized a watch party, and we watched it as a group, and all 8 of the released episodes at that time, with the anticipation that the movie or final episode would be coming out soon thereafter. And so now here we are, and I am going to approach this pretty much blind to the fandom. I am aware of it, I do not like it, and I do not have any need to engage in it or talk to anybody who is from the fandom. So if you are a diehard TADC fan, leave your comments so I can ban you. I don't know. That's probably unfair. If you have to leave a comment, make it nice. Anyway, this is actually quite a good series, all said and done. I like it quite a lot. And apparently the fandom does not, which is very funny to me, especially because it was given this theatrical release, and the fandom cannot keep its mouth shut, and was apparently, I avoided it, all over the internet spouting all kinds of things. I think there was also a leak of the final episode before it was released. So the fandom, even if you were avoiding everything about it directly, I found out by proxy that the fandom was very upset with the final episode, which, especially now having watched the final episode, is hilarious to me, because I think the final episode is excellent and, in fact, retroactively makes big chunks of the series better by its context. All right. Back around, let's get out of the meta talk and talk about the series as it is. So this is, as I understand it, it is a Glitch Studios production, but it is basically creatively directed. This particular project from them is creatively directed by Gooseworks, a particular artist who was sort of hired on for their project idea, and was deeply involved in how everything was storyboarded and written out, etc., etc. However, this was a production of like 2.5 years, almost 3, more than 2.5 years, almost 3 years. So in retrospect, and especially having most of my first experience with the entire series being a matter of hours, it's pretty apparent to me the ups and downs that the series had as it was being produced. Many of the episodes were 6 months apart between their releases, and there is some good and some bad to go with that. Some of it is just purely good in they got a better grasp on the artistic, the animation style they wanted to do for the art. There's more refinements and more expertise on display in terms of the production values and things like that. But then there's also problems like it is very apparent, even if I didn't already know other things about the series outside of the series itself, it's very apparent that the producers were aware of the fandom and, to some extent, hearing what the fandom was saying. Now, that does go both ways, and I'm not going to deep dive on that, but it's pretty clear that in some cases they catered to certain things the fandom wanted, were interested in, highlighted certain characters in certain ways, etc., etc. On the other hand, there are things that I see in this series that very much looks like they are there explicitly to troll the fandom. And apparently Gooseworks was on social media pretty engaged in trolling the fandom as well, which is a choice. But anyway, to come back around to the way this is produced, There's a lot to be said, and I've spoken to it to some extent before about what the side effects are of being social media aware when producing a series. There's certainly improvements that can be made when you can get fan feedback, but there's a lot of negative. There's a lot of, interference in the artistic vision and inconsistencies that can be introduced. Sometimes, I mean, you can introduce these same inconsistencies just by not being a great writer, but sometimes you just you introduce issues to a series by trying to change it on the fly. And there are certain elements, usually fairly minor, in this series that I see as being problems, probably as of the nature of its production. That it took a long time to make, and that the people making it were aware of the fandom around it. So that's all interesting context. To go back to the production itself, this is very much aping a lot of the style of the sort of late 90s, early 2000s CGI style. That's a whole thing I could delve into about the style and stuff, and there's little Easter eggs and things from the early days of CGI that I think are kind of fun, but I mean, it's all very minor stuff for the most part, just fun stuff. But it's an interesting visual style and is definitely striking. It is, not reminiscent of anything else coming out at the time. And in addition, the sort of theatrical stylings, the circus stylings of everything means that this is a bright, colorful series that also uses, light and shadow and, light and darkness to good effect to characterize various things. I don't always think that it is the most visually appealing that it could be. There are certain things I don't particularly like, but there are other things that I think they use really smartly. They use the flexibility of being purely CGI to do smart things with framing and camera, and again, lighting and that sort of thing. And they also use the full extent of the capabilities of 3D CG. In some ways, I think that's sort of a forgotten art. In certain ways, in modern times, three-dimensional CGI has really become largely very photorealistic. The focus on photorealism and the way that even marketing for the hardware and software for 3D CGI or even just video games focuses on photorealism for its, stunning visuals, I think has left a certain element of fantastical animation in the dust. And that's not to say that everybody should go back and do that, because there's a reason why we all rag on late 90s, early 2000s CGI. A lot of it looks pretty bad. But there are fun, smart things and animation techniques that are traditional to 2D animation styles, including the sort of absurd proportions and stretching and squishing of objects and things like that is more or less completely lost in the current era of 3D CGI. So to see a production that uses 3D CGI as a more flexible, more, animated rather than photorealism platform is really interesting. A production element that I just really like purely for its uniqueness, if nothing else. The audio throughout the series is generally quite good. They do very smart use of music, sound effects, and this is a sort of an ensemble cast of characters that, in order to, the use of spatial sound and stuff like that is all executed very, very cleanly. And for to be totally honest, I don't know what the budget for this series was across its whole run, but attention was paid. This is not a fan animation. It's not a school project or anything like that. This is professionally done and well done in that. So to get back to sort of the storytelling and the arc of the story, this is where we start to run into some of the foibles I have with the series. Generally speaking, after watching all 9 episodes, I think it comes together quite well. But that said, I think even just watching the first 8, and I really am going to sort of put a significant break between the first 8 and the 9th. There are issues with the arc of the writing. Some of it is just that certain episodes or certain chunks of episodes are often there more for flavor than they are for actual development. And this leads to a question about the initial vision versus the final vision of the story. This feels like it was very loosely framed in terms of the themes and the plot beats that it wanted to hit on and what each of the characters are, I'm going to say arcs, but they have very sort of limited arcs, was intended to be from the start. And so a lot of it feels like it sort of evolved a little bit on the fly. And in some ways that makes it feel very natural, and in other ways it feels a little bit unfocused. There are chunks of certain episodes that just feel like they're there mostly or only for the gag, or only to set up you can have a 5-10 minute chunk of something that's only there to set up a 30-second thing that actually leads to any plot development at all. But that is all, that can be a big problem if the rest of your production isn't good. But it's fundamentally still a reasonably entertaining show as it goes through those. I hesitate to call any of them bottle episodes or anything like that, but arcs that are not explicitly for plot development. The final episode really stands alone in a lot of ways in terms of being focused on wrapping up the narrative and focused on integrating all of the character development, however much of that there is, into sort of a cohesive final narrative. This doesn't feel like they were just trying to sweep everything up, just to be clear. I think some of the phrasing I used might have sounded like that. The final episode really does have a clear vision. And I think maybe it's a little awkwardly paced as a standalone episode, which may in fact be extra reason to really watch 8 and 9 together. But overall, I think the arc of the show can be a little inconsistent, or the plotting and the sort of tone of the show can be a little inconsistent, but ultimately comes out cleanly in the wash. Even watching all the way through, I guess I should set this up more clearly. My first watch was just the first episode back when it came out. Then, a couple months ago, watched 1 through 8. Then watched most of 1 through 8 again by myself. I also rewatched episode 1 multiple times. And now I've watched through 1 through 9 twice. This is, again, only a couple of hours after. I'm recording this a couple of hours after the episode came out. So I'm trying to, get a cohesive vision in addition to my sort of long arc of having watched it. And so having now watched, again, 1 through 9 in full, I think that it ultimately comes together pretty well. I think especially if you were only watching this piecemeal and you only watched each episode once and you only watched them as they came out, or even if you had only watched, 1 through 8 and then you finally watched 9, I think there's some of that doesn't really work. Some of the serialization elements of of the show don't play out super cleanly with the way the episodes break. And again, some of that is down to, I think, rewrites or changes or just new ideas that came up throughout the course of its development. But ultimately, I think it lands really nicely on that final episode. We'll put a pin in that final episode to talk about a little bit more, but I want to talk about the characters because I think that's really the focus. The narrative arc of the story is really not the most important thing. The story is, it's not a character study, but it's about the characters. The characters as they exist in the plot is what is really the focus. The emotional crux of everything that's happening is down to the evolution of each character from their initial presentation to what they become or what they stay as the story runs its course. And to what I was saying, I touched on a little bit earlier, the characters don't have super deep character arcs, and they have varying presentations as they go through, or varying amounts of presentation. So most of the characters are, I'm going to say most of the characters end up playing secondary to the main two, that being Pomni, who's sort of our focus character, and then Jax, who sort of acts as a foil or anti-hero type of character. And that sort of clash is really one of the main plots, which is secondary to the other main plot that's really set up at the very, very beginning of the first episode, which is that Pomni doesn't know how she got here and she wants to leave. And everybody else wants to leave too because this place kind of sucks, but they're stuck here. And that's really the whole arc of the show, at least in terms of the main narrative topics. But you keep watching not because of that, you keep watching because of the characters. And the characters, this is really a ragtag group of different weird individuals, all of whom have, at their core, some pretty significant traumas. Some, they have extreme behaviors. They have either explicit or implicit traumatic experiences that they came into the scenario with that are untreated and then define a lot of the behavior as they interact with others and try and navigate the stresses of the situations that they are in. This can be kind of flat and tropey. A lot of the characters are variants of traditional archetypes. And where they're not variants of traditional archetypes, they are pretty explicit tellings of certain traumatic backstories. Various sort of, this person has these familial issues, this person has, well, I don't want to get into any of the specifics, but the unpacking or lack of unpacking of their various issues and how those end up causing them to clash with each other and the world around them is really the focus. And like I said, this doesn't get super deep, but I think it gets deep enough to be satisfying, especially over the course of really what only amounts to about, I didn't do an exact count, but I think it's about 4 hours of total runtime for all 9 episodes. I think it's pretty solid. And a lot of that does end up coming down to the final episode. The final episode is really the emotional crux of the series. The first episode it's a decent pilot, but it's kind of a bad first episode because it sets up stakes and an understanding of the world, but really does actually sort of a major disservice to the tone and to the focus of the show. The first episode is very sardonic. It is very tongue-in-cheek, dark humor. It is very referential, not in really explicit ways, but it does a lot of things that are sort of nods to historical animation things or other series or stuff like that. And it's thankfully it doesn't, stray into Ready Player One kind of territory, anything like that. It's all fairly subtle, but a lot of it is just like, this is our play on a 90s funhouse type of TV show or animation or just the aesthetics of that era. And that's where we're going with this, along with the sort of general existential crisis of the digital circus. So the rest of the series then sort of ends up a lot of the episodes that follow slowly work to undo that sort of tone, and they get a little bit more. Each one gets a little bit more serious, gets a little bit more focused. It's less about the shenanigans. It's less about the individual jokes and quips, and it's more about the arc. It's more about having a few moments here and there, and then a few more moments here and there, and even more and more of character development, of character interaction, of characters being more than their archetype, of more than the tropes that they adhere to, and getting that final development. And I can kind of understand why chunks of the fandom apparently dislike the last episode, because if your attitude towards the show is, I just like my guy and I want my guy to have the perfect ending arc and I want everything to be satisfying at the end, you're going to be very disappointed by the final episode, I think. But if you feel that way, I think you missed the point of the entire series. To me, again, the point of the series is really about the characters and the ways they do and don't develop. So the final episode, to me, does a really good job of choosing which threads from the rest of the series that it's just going to truncate, it's just going to leave behind and not worry about, because they were ultimately, not because they, were intended to go somewhere and didn't, but because they were more of a secondary setup type of thing that doesn't lead to our final focus as cleanly as they want to. So the last episode really focuses much, much more than any of the other episodes that preceded it on emotional weight of genuine, having genuine approach to looking at traumas and experiences and the unpacking of various characters' issues that have been only maybe touched on or never fully explored in the rest of the series. But I think it ultimately, the last episode does it. If you wanted everything to be tied up cleanly, it was never going to. It was impossible in that amount of time. But I think it does a brilliant job of saying, all of those things we were worried about kind of don't matter in the further context we're developing here. That these things have happened and we're moving on from the situation. This is very in the same type of experience that the characters are having, that things have happened. They need to change their attitudes towards the world around them and what they need to do now, and to the people around them and how they can work together, can't work together, need to do things differently, etc. So the last episode does such a nice job of finally taking some very explicit deep dives into character psychology to help give everyone some closure. Not everybody gets like a full, emotional arc, but the relationships developed earlier in the series, the interactions between individual characters, lead the certain emotional elements and character development elements that are shown in the last episode to sort of by proxy help resolve a lot of the issues that the other characters are dealing with, either explicitly or implicitly. There's also some really nice reflections back to earlier in the series where it's not subverting its own writing, but it says that thing that we made fun of earlier. It doesn't apologize for things it does earlier, but it says, hey, wait a minute, these characters are in a different place now. They're feeling a different kind of way, and they're going to reapproach something they already looked at and have a more earnest, direct emotional response, and to have a better takeaway from it, and have a more productive attitude going forward. And I think I'm going to stop rambling too much about the remainder of the episode, because at that point I'll just start talking about the individual plot beats. But I think the final episode is a really nice closure to the series. Just watching 1 through 8, I'm not sure if I think I would have recommended it with reservations. But watching 1 through 9 in full, I think brings it to a really nice close. Overall, I think I'm generally very happy with the series. I think it, lacks some of the polish that a larger production might have. It has a few errors here and there because they're not going back to fix animations from 2 years ago, or recut anything or re-record anything. But generally, the production itself is so well done that I have very little to complain about in that respect. Just again, to cap this whole thing off, if you are interested in this, if it doesn't immediately put you off in the first episode, then I think this is a really good, a really solid expenditure of, a couple of hours. And just stay away as much as you can from anything about the fandom, about the people in the fandom, about any of that kind of stuff. The level of virality that this reached, made it just unbelievably gross and weird and toxic. And that's coming from someone who only sort of saw the very edges of it from a distance and tried to avoid it. There are a lot of people, the vast majority of this fandom has no critical reading skills, doesn't understand subtext, doesn't understand anything other than my colorful Blorbo is my favorite Blorbo, and I'm excited to see them, and I will buy all the merch. Because this is also partially the doing of the production agency, because they put out a lot of official merch, like swaths of official merch every time they released a new episode, which is wild, and I guess good for them for their success, but also dug their own hole a little bit there, dug their own grave, got themselves in their own trouble. But anyway, I think the series is pretty solid, and just stay away from the fandom. And definitely, knock on wood, they're not going to make a sequel, right? There's no reason to make a sequel. This is a nice, clean ending. Please do not make a sequel. God, please don't. Anyway, thank you for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you for something different next time.